Hello, welcome to Liberty Explored. Today we're going to talk about mind control, brainwashing, simulation theory, propaganda, and television. So buckle up. So, what do we have going on with this? This is going to be an interesting one because I want to talk a little bit, start off with about brainwashing and the type of control that is happening today and kind of tracing it back to through history. Now, just to briefly go over what brainwashing is, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the concept, but I think it's a funny word. I think it's a glossed over word, a word that's it just sounds good, and that's why it got used so frequently. But it's not very accurate. Brainwashing sounds much more benign than it is. It sounds like you're cleaning your mind, cleaning the brain, and that's very much not what it is. I think a more accurate word, um, going off the same terminology, would be to call it brain painting. Brain painting. The reason is because the concept of brainwashing is more about manipulation and control. It's about planting things in somebody's mind and less about cleaning out what's already there. And brainwashing really goes back a long time. Um, I think it gets deeper as we get into history, and you can trace it through all sorts of political and power control systems. And it seems like the bigger and more powerful a person gets, a nation gets, or a company gets, that the desire to control people's minds and thus maintain power becomes more prevalent. And and this has gone back through the dawn of history. As I mean, you can just trace it back through the very nature of humanity, the human nature. It's riddled with the desire to increase power, and you see this time and time again. And essentially, this is why empires fall, is because of the negative aspect of this, which is what I'd like to highlight today and talk about a little bit. So, last night I had a super weird dream, and it was a negative dream. It was a nightmare, and I was influenced by a show I watched last night a little bit called Black Rabbit. Now that's on Netflix. Anybody can watch it. I find it uh, to be at first not that interesting. However, once I got into it a little bit, it's a little more engaging and disturbing, and it caused me to actually was like one of the characters in that show last night in my dream. And it was a pervasive dream, not one of those nightmares where it just happens kind of quick, and then you move on to another dream realm. This was like a pervasive dream, as if my mind had been affected pretty heavily by this show. And I remember my dreams pretty well lately, so I'm able to track my dreams throughout the night, and I could tell that more so than normal, because I watch shows here and there. Not a big TV addict, but I recognize that it has a certain quality and that it is the modern day weapon of the information warfare landscape. And I just want to kind of elaborate upon that as we go through this topic. So, as I was dreaming, I woke up at one point pretty disturbed, and it actually gave me the idea for wanting to do this video today, and really um, to talk about how we use the media nowadays in a very subtle way. We use TV and movies. And when I say we, I mean the collective nation, the powers that be inside this nation. And they have a long history of using television. If you even listen to the word television, it's literally saying what it is, that it's going to tell you what your vision is going to be. And propaganda has been studied for many years. And in more recent years, it's been experimented with at the brainwashing level, the desire to plant things in people's minds. And I would also underlie it that the goal is not just to plant something in somebody's mind, but more so to not allow anyone to think that somebody else is doing it, to hide the source of the desire to control, and to do it in a more subtle and nuanced way that allows the individual who's being brainwashed, who's being coerced into a certain way of thinking, into thinking that it's coming from themselves. And that's one of the most fundamental parts of how this works and what this concept is. And when we really look deeply at propaganda, it's a weapon for brainwashing. And information in the information landscape of today is mostly propaganda. And almost all the information we get is a controlled outlet. It's a controlled content simulation. And I think it's real interesting. Let's review really quick this book, which is called Simulacra and the Simulation by Jean Baudrillard. And this book is really, really very interesting. And really quick, I just want to go through some of the concepts that the book talks about. It talks about the 4 stages of the simulacra. And the first stage is reflection of basic reality. So that's like a picture. It's like taking a picture, and essentially it's a replica, but in a simulated realm. It's something else. It's not the real thing, but it's a picture of the real thing. And up until modern day times, you could pretty much rely on that being a reflection of the truth. Although, if one does a little bit deeper dive, you'll notice that actually Photoshop methodology has been around for a very long time, and people could do that in the darkroom by cutting out things and re-exposing negatives and photography. And essentially, you could do Photoshop techniques since the dawn of photography. So the concept of manipulating information and hiding it has always been there. And one of the most obvious examples would be history. And you really can't trust anything in history, sadly, because history is another form of simulation. It's not the real thing that happened. It's a telling of it. And unless there's some integrity underlying the storyteller, a desire to replicate the truth, then it's different than this first version, a reflection of basic reality. It has the ability to be what the second concept is here, the second stage of simulation, which is masks and perversion of reality. So history, for instance, can be manipulated just by retelling a story in the way that, for instance, makes the villain the hero. That would be the most obvious example, and that's happened throughout history over and over and over again, which is why the farther you go back into history, the less likely you are to find an actual reflection of reality of the first example, the first stage of simulation. Now let's just quickly go through the other two. The third stage is masks in the absence of reality. So that's once you've completely retold the story, or you've photoshopped the picture into a whole new thing. And even though it's based on some truth, you've completely changed the story. It's a completely new thing. And today in our information landscape, we're filled with it. AI is a big contributor to this, but it's been around for a long time. Photoshop has been around for a long time. And like I said, manipulation techniques go back to the dawn of history. And the fourth one is bears no relation to reality whatsoever. So that's where you can literally just make up a reality. And traditionally in storytelling, we called that fiction. But nowadays, the blur between fiction and reality is invisible. You can't quite tell what is real anymore. And these four stages of simulation and the simulacra and the simulation underlie everything that we see today. And this book was written, I believe, in 1981. So this is a pretty old concept. This has been around for a while, since before Photoshop. So I find it really interesting because there's something pertinent about this concept and how it's used to manipulate people's minds and get into the brain painting, as I like to call it, or brainwashing, that is happening all around us. Now, one of the things I notice when you start getting deeper into what is real, what is reality, is that it seems like because of the CIA doing these types of manipulation tests on society, on the population, it just seems like we would only know that if there were people out there paying attention to this, because there's definitely a desire to hide it, and the ways that it comes up in ourselves is it feels like we have our own independent sovereignty of thought and of being, in that our reality is the authentic reality. And I would argue that that is very much not so. And I often wonder why certain people are more susceptible to this type of manipulation than others. It seems to me like some of my especially smart friends, or friends who I used to think were extremely smart, have a particular susceptibility to this. Now, is that because when you assume that your reality is the authentic reality, that you refuse to accept any other input as being tied into the simulacra? I think so. I think there's something to that. So we see a prevalence of this in academia. The professors who rely on these history books, for instance, they might even have a certain type of definitive way they talk about things without really paying attention to the history of the simulation. And let me bring up one really important connection to that, which is one of the oldest books um, that we have in modern times, oldest type of books that are out there that reference books from it that predate it, and that is the Bible. And I want to quickly share the story of Zechariah Sitchin, who was raised in a strict religious Jewish family. And he was taught at a very early age Hebrew and had a rabbi who gave him advice and as a young kid. And one of the interesting things about Hebrew, well, of course, the Old Testament is primarily comes from the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew language and the Hebrew alphabet is numeric. And all the original alphabets of other languages were numeric, or they had a numeric component to them. So even our ABCs stems from the Hebrew numeric chronology of words and alphabet. So it turns out that one of the things Zechariah Sitchin learned at a very early age was that all the stories in the Hebrew Bible, but just the Hebrew stories in general, would follow this numeric pattern. And so they would start with Aleph, Aleph being the word where we get A from. And because the numeric sequence was important, essentially that would be the number one, right? And it'd be like kind of like in our fairy tales, beginning the fairy tale with "Once upon a time." That's a very common feature in English fairy tales. But in Hebrew, they would start with Aleph. And I find it extremely interesting because this underlies this rewriting of history. So let me explain. When he would ask his rabbi about that specifically, the rabbi would always say, "Oh yes, these words begin with that, and that's just the way it is." And but once the very very first translation or the story in the Old Testament was missing that word Aleph, and so Zechariah Sitchin, being the curious little kid that he was, asked his rabbi. He said, "Hey, why is that word missing from the beginning of the story?" And the rabbi said, "Shut up, you little kid. Pay attention. Don't worry about it," or something of that nature. And it turned out when you added this word in, which he did at a later date once he reached his 20s and he started asking the questions that you might ask if you remember the questions you had as a little kid that were never answered. Sometimes the kids have the most obvious of perspectives, the most obvious viewpoints, like the emperor wears no clothes, the little kid who pointed out, "Hey, the king's naked." And so when Zechariah Sitchin remembered that he hadn't ever been answered that question, he decided to look it up and to put that word back into the origin of, into the story of Genesis. So when he did, it changed the meaning to something like, "There were the gods, the heavens, and the word." And what I find interesting about that is that this underlies the concept that you can take words out of history and replace them or leave them out intentionally to create a specific type of mind control effect. Now, what is mind control? I mean, essentially, that means that there are people out there who want to control your mind, who want to play the hidden hand, whether it's a government or just people in power or companies. And when they do this, it's always had the same, it comes from the same type of desire. So I find it interesting to note that government, when broken down to its root uh, words, the word govern is means control, and ment means mind. So it literally is, government is controlling the mind. That's what it's meant to do. That's what it's designed for. And I think you got to look a little bit deeper at these words to discover the true meaning of what is what in this reality. What is the authentic reality and what is the simulacra? What is the simulation? And it could be anything in the simulation, could be any of these four phases, four stages of simulation. But also the simulation can be um, something so hidden that you never actually understand that it's the simulation. Now, a lot of people believe that we're in a different kind of simulation, actually, a fully simulated reality because of the advancement of virtual reality and games and game theory. We're very close to the point where you could completely imitate reality, but it takes a lot of computing power. And however, you can basically project that we're very close to it just through the ability to create these types of virtual reality spaces. And things like Unreal Engine are a pretty good example of that. And as a person who's done development for games, I know a little bit about that. And I think once you understand how Unreal Engine works and the way it draws the most nearest reality, because that's the most important part, what you can see in your immediate periphery, in your immediate area, your immediate space, is the most important part. That needs to be done with the highest level of computing power. And as you get in stages farther away from the center, there are different stages of computing assigned to that stage, because just like how things kind of blur in the distance, it turns out you don't need to have that much detail in the visual reality that you're presenting, or audio. So as things get farther away, they don't need to be simulated anymore. Now, the simulation theory also has been somewhat proven by the double slit experiment. And the double slit experiment has to do with proving that at an atomic level, it actually matters whether or not somebody is observing the reality that's being tested or recorded versus it happening without anybody observing it. And this brings up a very old Zen koan, which is, if a tree falls in the distance, does it actually, and nobody can hear it, does it actually make a noise? And if you believe the simulation theory, that we're in a simulation now, the obvious answer would be no. And I think it's interesting because obviously Zen monks had come upon this concept on their own. Whether you call it a simulation or not, it's observable reality that is really at the depths of what is real. And meditation is a lot of that. One of the focuses of meditation is just trying to empty the mind because it's filled with this repeating storyline that just kind of goes, that voice in your head, and to try and get yourself to allow that to pass through you and then to have nothing there. And it's a very, very difficult thing. So this has been around for a very long time. And like I said, it goes back to the earliest stories of the Bible and people hiding certain types of information through history, which is why history also cannot be trusted. Now, yesterday I shared a really cool quote from Walt Whitman. And let me pull that up really quick. Okay. So this quote is: "Re-examine all you have been told in school or church or in any book, and dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your flesh, your very flesh, shall be a great poem." I think what's interesting about that is, and Walt Whitman is a very great poet himself, and the concept that this is a shared observation across all different uh, types of personalities and character types, archetypes of people, across all different careers and different um, aspects of observation. So not only do monks look into this concept, but really it's relative to anybody, which is the concept of re-examining what is real on a daily basis so that you can make yourself a great poem or a great observer of truth. So something very interesting about that to me, I find that as we get into trying to understand why are people so easily manipulated, this is a really heavy concept. And I mean, I feel sorry for so many of my friends who turn on me or turn on each other, turn on themselves really, when they get mad at me just for bringing up these concepts. Just to bring up, well, I understand why. It has to do with the ego. So the ego very much does not like to be told that it's wrong. There's something deep inside all of us where we share this particular reality of being sort of stuck in our own head, and there's power in the independence of sovereign thought, of the uniqueness of our own perspective, and it's insulting to be told that we did not design the reality that we are presenting, that we are essentially just puppets being pushed around. People hate being called puppets. People hate to be called a lemming. However, the reason why those metaphors exist, um, that is because it's also an observable reality. The reason why different people, like great poets like Walt Whitman, speak on this exact thing, it's because it's an observable reality and a challenge for all of us. It's also why the Zen monks meditate on this concept and we're able to articulate that particular koan about the tree falling. So, as we delve deeper into the concept of what is true, what is reality, we find ourselves at the gates of a great question, which is how do we define what is true? And how can we create a map that guides us through this reality in a way? Because there is, no matter what, there is some element of free will. And this is just a very big question, and it's very deep, and it goes across all planes of religion and knowledge, of thought and wisdom. And I think the answer is unique for everybody. The answer is somewhere inside yourself. The answer is possibly, I don't know, but I could tell you from my experience what my best methods are. And the first one would be to assume that all information is a lie or a method for control, and to try and trace the source as much as you can so that you can find the intention of that information. Does this information serve a purpose that aligns with the needs of a business? Does it serve the purpose that aligns with the needs of somebody in power? And by assuming first that everything is false, or that it all is a manipulation method for control, you're able to sift through the weeds, so to speak, of what is real a little bit easier. It sounds negative. It sounds like a hurtful way to see information. And like I said, this is just my technique. It's not going to work for everybody. I find it very strange, though, that so many people fall for the majority of propaganda, that they fall for mind control, and can't tell what any of those 4 stages of the simulation are, and whether they are in authentic reality. Now, I think the authentic reality can be summarized best by free will. And if our ability to have free will is encapsulated by a very difficult choice, if the choice is something so challenging that it really makes you think, that is, I believe, where free will is happening. If we're not really making the choice and we're just going with something somebody else said, I think that most often, if not all the time, is the simulation. And because we live in a time where AI is actually reaching a higher level of knowledge, a higher level of capacity than a human, where it knows more or has the content read into it because it's analyzed the whole of the internet, because it's read every book that's publicly available. Now, I was able to ask AI what if it would summarize that book for me. And it quickly gave me the summary of this book. And let me just pull that up. So I'll just read that to you. Jean Baudrillard's Simulacra and the Simulation, 1981, is one of the key postmodern texts about reality, representation, and meaning in contemporary society. It explores how symbols, signs, and media no longer simply reflect reality, but instead replace it or create it. and it gives a quick overview. Core idea: simulation is not just imitation, it's the generation of reality by models, codes, and systems of signs. In modern culture, signs don't point to a real thing behind them. Instead, they refer to other signs, creating self contained loops of meaning. This leads to simulacra, representations that don't refer to any actual reality, but are taken as reality themselves. Now, this comes from 1981, so I was only 9 years old when this book was written, and I did not have any understanding of this. I only learned about this book this year. However, that concept I'm very familiar with, and I found this concept to be something that I have created my own system for getting around, like the one I mentioned. And it stems from growing up in this information reality. I think Gen Zers maybe are even way better at it than I am, partly because I see a lot of Gen Zers talking about the truth of Israel and their manipulation and control of society and their power. And Israel has a particular, especially the Zionists, the Israeli Zionists, have a particular power in this world, not only through banking, but positions of power in companies, in government. And it appears that they are operating from these playbooks at a very high degree and in complete hidden form, in a fashion that is invisible and unbeknownst to especially the older people in society seem to have fallen for it completely. So the boomer generation and the silent generation seem to be completely taken by just hearing the same thing repeated over and over again on TV. It's as if they don't understand that TV, meaning television, is telling them what their vision is. They don't have that natural barrier that I have built in place. It's as if I have a fortress around my mind protecting it. Yet these Gen Zers seem to really be, it's like they built an even better one than I have. Or maybe it's because they've been exposed to this at such a young age that it's just a built-in response, a defense mechanism of the soul, or something like that. And so I have to give a lot of respect to the Gen Zers who are coming from this perspective, who are coming from this reality, because I think that they really are doing the right thing. They've got the right idea, and they're not going to put up with just being told a false reality. It's not going to work just by repeating something over and over to them. And I say, kudos. Good job. You have passed the test. And boomers, I say, fuck you. You are missing it completely. And it's sad. It really is. And I'm also pissed off by any of the other young people who don't get this automatically, but I understand. I don't really blame you, especially because if your parents are deeply embedded in this type of brainwashing, they're easily going to pass it down to their children. And I see that I see this on a daily basis. I see people like my mom being completely taken by a particular type of hate for Donald Trump. And what I find it interesting is, at least in me, when I look at something and I hate it, or I try to cut it out of my life, like in a way that, so it's not, usually I hate things only because of them manipulating me. It's that manipulation that I hate, really. It's not them. And so, I mean, that's part of my trying to seek to only blame the source and not the messenger. And all these people who are just acting as police, they're really doing the thought police from 1984. I saw on Bill Maher the other day, he had on Seth Green, and Seth Green clearly clueless about this kind of stuff. And Bill Maher actually gets this sometimes. He's still got that boomer ideology going, that boomer take on things where he's still totally consumed by a particular type of thinking. But he also recognizes that hate crime is just thought police from 1984. It's just a thought crime. And that actual crime is something like murder, right? So he mentioned that to Seth Green, and Seth Green was like, "Oh, I think I understand. I get your point," or something like that. However, his ability to absorb that information, I mean, I would just guess is limited just based on what his words were of what he was talking about. So, what is real and what is the simulation? Where does this type of hate crime or thought crime get used to control people, and why are the boomers so susceptible to this stuff? Why are people like my mom constantly talking about Trump if they hate him? Well, you can see this through the repeated application of this information science. There's a science behind simulation theory. There's a science behind brainwashing, and it's been studied by the CIA. It's been studied by every society, and guaranteed every nation is doing this right now. And this is why I think you just really start by thinking of everything as a lie first. And you can take things like the CIA doing Operation Mockingbird, MK Ultra. The only way we found out about this was because of FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act. And this stuff only gets revealed much later. It appears that people have a very short attention span and a very short memory cycle that maybe is even getting shorter and shorter. Now, what causes that? I don't really know. It's a very disturbing component of this reality. That's why I particularly want to talk about this and point this stuff out. It appears that when somebody is under a repeated onslaught of the same information, even if it goes against everything you believe, at some point it will become reality for you. So in the case of my mom, where she watches MSNBC and Midas Touch every day for a majority of the day, she might hear, because they literally are nonstop talking about Donald Trump. That's all they talk about. I know because I hear it when I walk in and observe the reality of any time that she's around and watching this stuff. I might eavesdrop in and listen in. And when you're repeatedly told something over and over and over again, it just becomes reality. And the ego becomes attached to it in a way that makes it sovereign to yourself. It makes it your own, even though it's clearly a mind control tactic. This is definitely brainwashing 101. And I find it very interesting because why would you listen to something who mentions somebody's name if you hate them? And do you really hate them, or do you just hate the idea that they're proposing, or that you've been told they're proposing? Do you hate you hate the type of information that they're presenting? To me, that's more likely. But when you can see this over and over again in the case of what they call Trump derangement syndrome. And I think all you have to do is ask one of these people who are clearly suffering from it just a question about themselves or reality, and they'll answer with some relationship to Trump, as if the hate for him is so consuming that it completely guides their own reality. And what does that really mean for them? Does that mean they're in control of themselves? I think not. Once you watch these programs, this gets back to trying to understand what is the underlying purpose for why certain types of information is presented. In the case of Midas Touch or MSNBC and CNN, well, Midas Touch is a program that's literally funded specifically for the purpose of trying to keep Trump from having any power. That means that it doesn't matter what a host desires to present, if it only can present information on that network, if it fits that paradigm, if it fits that general concept of that goal of what's trying to be presented by the very mandate of the organization itself, their mission statement. When you understand that all companies have these types of mission statements that sometimes evolve, I think CNN used to be a pretty good news agency, although as you look deeper, it becomes more questionable how far this type of manipulation string has been pulled along in a way that's merely to create the simulation for us of reality. Just Operation Mockingbird itself goes back to the early days of CNN. And so you can really see that CNN, though, has evolved to be a liberal news organization. And there's some type of report. I should pull it up, but it's not. This is just an observable reality. You can see that as a response, I believe, to Fox News deciding to completely, or Fox as a network, back when cable was the prominent source of information, it became apparent because of the type of understanding of how these things work, of how brainwashing formulas actually work, and the A/B testing that they do when they're testing engagement from consumers, when they're testing engagement and how long watch time is of a particular channel or a particular network. Fox was the first to realize that if they polarized towards one side and polarized towards the conservative Republican Party, that would increase their engagement, that it would increase their watch time from these unaware consumers, these people totally not really understanding that they're being manipulated. And because that was such a powerful technique, the ones who were already primarily liberal, CNN, MSNBC, and pretty much all the other TV news network stations, they all dug in deeper on the liberal side and on the Democrat side. And that became it became a more necessary reaction after a certain amount of time of Fox and their success. Fox for a long time was the highest rated news program on cable news. And all those other news agencies wanted a piece of that. And it had also worked for a long time with certain um, with certain newspapers. So the print world had already gone through this, and much of it had become polarized to different sides. And you can clearly see it now today. New York Times is just completely liberal news information, just like MSNBC, just like CNN, just like Fox News is a conservative news organization. And there's a few other ones on the conservative side, but it seems that the majority of the mainstream news has been dominated by this liberal ideology. And so getting back to why does it work so well on boomers? Well, it works so well because they don't understand the simulation. They don't understand the brainwashing technique, and this stuff, for somebody like my mom, who I feel very bad for, because it it must suck to be consumed with this much hate. Yeah, and I see it oftentimes in her presence of being, and just in the way she talks to me. It's there's just a lot of hate in there. There's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. And I feel for them. I really do. It's a difficult reality to be consumed by hate. It's a difficult reality when you don't understand that it's not you, and that it's coming from something much deeper, a type of control mechanism that's has its own self-interest at hand. Um, Literally none of that is based on the public self-interest. And um, just to bring this all home, I want to say that there's something really cool about the United States, about how it was formed. I think before the United States was formed, Britain was the superpower of the world. Uh, they had gained power from uh, who had it previously, which I believe was East India Trading Company, who had these types of power systems seem to have been following royal bloodlines. And inside this corrupt system of control, America emerged, the United States, as a breaking off from the pattern. And our very documents that the founding fathers created are a reflection of this very deep thought that happened, and discussion about how to make a better system that's outside of this forced reality of control, of taxation, and I mean, even just the concept no taxation without representation. That's a very bold breakaway concept that underlies the foundation of the United States, the foundation of Declaration of Independence. And sadly, we've gone back into this royal bloodline control. Now, I don't think they ever stopped. I think when the United States broke away from the royal bloodlines of Britain, I mean, Britain was already fighting for its own power. They only were the world power by a little bit. All these other nations were vying for power, and they would do everything they could to gain it. And there are many, many wars and many systems of manipulation and mind control, techniques of propaganda, anything that could be done to facilitate this type of control. And I think it's just notable to think about the fact that this country was founded in a really fabulous, fantastic way, as a way to break apart from that. And it succeeded for a period of time. And we're still living in it. where even though there's all these bizarre laws that have been created, which essentially have given the power back to certain bloodlines, certain centers of power, certain families who have had a lot of power for a very, very long time. Even though that's still where we are now, we live in a country that was created as a breakaway from that. And at the very heart of the intention of this country lies this beautiful independence, which is a reminder for anyone who wants to go down this path. It's a reminder for our own self sovereignty, of our own free will. And this is where all this stuff sort of comes together. And it's really the meaning of this video today that I wanted to share, which is to remind everybody of your own free will and your own ability to discern what is good and what is bad, what is part of the simulation, and what is the authentic reality that we live in. And all the friends who might have turned on you in this great unfriending, great unfollowing, following Charlie Kirk's assassination, those people are consumed by the simulacrum. And they're consumed by the fourth stage. But really, they're, in their mind, they're in the first stage. They're in the reflection of basic reality. They think that the news that they're being told is a reflection of the authentic truth. They haven't learned this one skill. And so we have to forgive them. We have to understand that this is part of their path to finally come to this realization. And hopefully we can get through this where they do come to this realization, and things like AI can actually be a tool for helping weed through the truth of what is real. And maybe as AI turns into AGI, maybe we can actually get closer to this reality. And just the fact that I can recognize this and notice it gives me hope. It gives me hope because I can see so many of my friends turning against each other because they don't see it. And yet I can see it. And I've found a reminder of how this relates to God and the discernment of good and evil is exactly what the very foundation principle that our founding fathers tried to lay out for us. They could even see the potential of this happening in the far future and tried to give us a guide for getting through it. And I think that's a great thing. And it's phenomenal for myself that I can be a part of sharing this reality with you all. It gives me hope that I see multiple people realizing this in real time, or being like me where they've kind of known this all along. I don't really know what makes the difference, what causes some people to be on one side or the other. I think that, it's partly represented by the duality of nature, as if it's an important way of seeing the whole or getting to that. So you almost have to thank those people for existing so that we can have the differentiation of vision to discern good from evil, to discern the simulation from the authentic reality. And with that, I'll leave you all with an I love you, and I hope that everyone can find authentic reality for themselves and see through the simulation, see through the control mechanism, and find their own individuality and sovereign self. I hope they can find the good in themselves and turn to each other with a positive reflection and share that with each other. I truly believe that is possible. And so I love you all. God bless. And I'll see you next time.